Empires collapsed. Millions died. New nations were born. From the muddy trenches of the Western Front to the deserts of the Middle East, World War I reshaped the map, rewired modern warfare, and shattered an entire generation's belief in progress. This is the story of how a continent sleepwalked into catastrophe, how ordinary people became part of something unimaginably vast, and how the consequences of this war still echo in our world today. From the assassination in Sarajevo to the Treaty of Versailles, through revolutions, gas attacks, U-boats, and dogfights, discover the war that changed everything. This is the complete history of World War I. The Great War, a complete history of World War I. 1. Introduction: the world before the storm. In the summer of 1914, the world was at a crossroads. A fragile peace held sway over Europe. Not the peace of contentment, but the tense silence of empires bristling with arms, suspicious of neighbors, and stewing in centuries-old rivalries. No one imagined that a single spark in a small Balkan city would plunge the world into a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. But within weeks of a gunshot in Sarajevo, millions were marching to war. The Great War, as it came to be known before there was a second one, would leave no continent untouched, no empire unshaken, and no family unscarred. World War I was a conflict of firsts and lasts. It was the first truly global war, fought not only in Europe but across Asia, Africa, and the seas. It was the last war of empires, with dynasties that had ruled for centuries collapsing into dust. It introduced industrial-scale slaughter, mechanized warfare, and the modern concept of total war, and in its wake left a legacy of broken nations, redrawn maps, and a haunting question: how could such a war begin? 2. Origins and causes of the war. The long fuse of history. To understand World War I, one must look not to a single moment or event, but to a continent tangled in pride, paranoia, and ambition. The roots of the war stretched deep into the 19th century. When nationalism surged, empires expanded, and industrial might gave birth to massive militaries. Nationalism was one of the most potent forces. Across Europe, nations were gripped by intense pride, sometimes healthy, often dangerous. In Germany and Italy, unification had been achieved through blood and iron. Slavic peoples in the Balkans longed for independence or union under a shared banner. Meanwhile, multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire struggled to contain the swelling tides of self-determination within their borders. Imperialism added another layer of friction. The scramble for Africa and the race for colonies in Asia had turned European powers into global rivals. Britain, France, and Germany jockeyed for dominance overseas, their disputes in the colonies feeding suspicions at home. The British Empire, spanning the globe, viewed any threat to its naval supremacy as existential. Germany, a newly unified and ambitious nation, sought its place in the sun, even if that meant casting a shadow over others. Then came militarism, the glorification of military power and readiness for war. The late 19th century saw an arms race unlike any before. Germany and Britain competed to build dreadnought battleships. France and Germany increased their armies. War, once viewed as a last resort, began to seem like an inevitable, even desirable, test of national strength. And binding all of this together were alliances meant to deter war, but in practice creating a tinderbox. By 1914, Europe was divided into two major blocs: the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy; the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. These alliances promised mutual defense, but also guaranteed that any local conflict had the potential to trigger a continent-wide inferno. The Balkans, Europe's powder keg. Nowhere was this danger more visible than in the Balkans, a rugged, fiercely independent region in southeastern Europe. The collapse of Ottoman power had created a vacuum, and emerging states like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania vied for territory and influence. Austria-Hungary, alarmed by Slavic nationalism on its southern border, sought to tighten its grip. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Slavs, supported Serbia. It was in this volatile cauldron that the final spark would fall. June 28, 1914, a shot in Sarajevo. On a bright June morning in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, rode through the city with his wife, Sophie. They were on a goodwill visit, but the air was tense. Bosnia had been annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, angering Serbs who claimed it should belong to a greater Serbia. Waiting in the crowd was a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip, a member of the radical nationalist group Black Hand. Earlier in the day, a failed bombing attempt had rattled the Archduke. But fate, in a wrong turn, brought his car directly in front of Princip hours later. The young assassin stepped forward and fired 2 shots, one into Franz Ferdinand's neck, the other into Sophie's abdomen. They both died within minutes. The July crisis, a world on the brink. The murder of an archduke might have passed as a tragic but local matter. But Austria-Hungary saw it as a chance to crush Serbia and snuff out Slavic nationalism. Backed by Germany, who offered a so-called blank check of support, Austria issued an ultimatum to Serbia with harsh demands. Serbia accepted most, but not all, of the terms. It wasn't enough. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia. Germany, in turn, declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, began to mobilize. Germany declared war on France, then invaded neutral Belgium to reach Paris. Britain, honoring its treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. In just over a month, the entire continent was engulfed. 3. The descent into war, 1914. How the War of Plans became a war of attrition, mobilization, and madness. By the end of July 1914, a chain reaction of mobilizations and declarations of war had locked Europe into a course from which no nation could easily retreat. Unlike today, mobilizing an army in 1914 was a massive undertaking, involving trains, timetables, and a sense of irreversible momentum. To call up reserves and send troops to the front required weeks of logistical planning, and once started, it was hard to stop. This was especially true for Germany and Russia, whose war plans were rigid and time-sensitive. And so, one by one, the great powers activated their war machines. July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. July 30th, Russia mobilized against Austria and Germany. August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. August 4th, Germany invaded Belgium. Britain declared war on Germany. August 6th to 12th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Russia, Serbia on Germany, France and Britain on Austria-Hungary. Within a week, Europe's lights, as British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey famously said, were going out. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's fatal gamble. Germany faced a strategic nightmare. War on 2 fronts, Russia in the east, France in the west. To deal with this, they had developed the Schlieffen Plan, a bold and flawed strategy that aimed to knock France out of the war quickly by sweeping through Belgium and flanking Paris from the north. Once France fell, Germany could turn its full might on the slower-moving Russians. But Belgium's resistance and Britain's entry into the war in response to the invasion upset the timetable. Worse, the speed and ferocity of German advance outraged the world. German troops committed atrocities against Belgian civilians, shooting hostages, burning villages, in what came to be known as the Rape of Belgium. The violence, while partially exaggerated in Allied propaganda, fueled international condemnation and turned public opinion sharply against Germany. France and the Battle of the Frontiers. Meanwhile, the French had their own plan, Plan 17, based on the belief in Elan Vital, or fighting spirit. French troops launched attacks into Alsace and Lorraine, eager to reclaim lost territory from the Franco-Prussian War. But the Germans were ready. French soldiers in bright blue coats and red trousers, remnants of a pre-modern battlefield, were cut down by machine guns and artillery. By August's end, France had suffered catastrophic losses. The Germans, though bloodied, were still advancing, pushing deep into northern France, seemingly unstoppable. The miracle of the Marne. In early September 1914, the German armies stood just 30 miles from Paris. The city prepared for siege, government officials fled. But Germany's plan, so precise on paper, began to unravel. Their flanks were stretched thin, their soldiers exhausted from weeks of marching, and supply lines strained. Crucially, they had failed to account for the resilience of French forces. In a daring counteroffensive, French and British troops under General Joseph Joffre struck back at the First Battle of the Marne, September 6 to 12. In a now legendary episode, thousands of Parisian taxi drivers were commandeered to transport troops to the front, a moment that came to symbolize national unity and improvisation. The Germans were forced to retreat. Paris was saved. The Schlieffen Plan was dead. The race to the sea and the rise of trenches. After the Marne, both sides began maneuvering north, trying to outflank one another in what became the race to the sea. But there was no sea to reach, only the cold, muddy coast of Flanders. By November 1914, a continuous line of defensive trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. This was the beginning of trench warfare, a grim, grinding form of battle that would come to define the Western Front for the next 4 years. The war of movement had ended. A war of stagnation, of mud, wire, and shellfire had begun. Early battles beyond the Western Front. While most eyes were on France and Belgium, fighting erupted elsewhere as well. On the Eastern Front, Russian armies invaded East Prussia but were soundly defeated by German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff at the Battle of Tannenberg. Austria-Hungary, meant to be Germany's strong right arm, stumbled disastrously in Serbia and Galicia, suffering heavy losses. The Ottoman Empire, not yet in the war, was being courted by both sides. In October, a German-led Ottoman raid on Russian ports drew the empire into the conflict on the side of the Central Powers. Meanwhile, around the world, Britain and France began seizing German colonial outposts in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Christmas 1914, the war pauses briefly. In one of the war's most poignant and human moments, soldiers on both sides along the Western Front spontaneously halted fighting during Christmas 1914. In some sectors, they sang carols across the trenches. In others, they emerged to shake hands, exchange gifts, and even play football in no man's land. It was a moment of shared humanity and a reminder of the war's madness. By New Year's, orders came down forbidding such truces. The war machine would not tolerate peace. By year's end, by the end of 1914, the war had consumed over 1 million lives, and it had only just begun. What was meant to be a short, decisive campaign had become a global quagmire. Politicians had hoped their boys would be home by Christmas. Instead, Europe had embarked on an abyss with no clear end in sight. For the Western Front, stalemate and slaughter. Hell cannot be so terrible. A soldier at the Somme. Trench warfare, the new reality. By early 1915, the Western Front had frozen into a bizarre, terrifying landscape. A vast maze of trenches, dug into the earth from the North Sea to the Swiss border, divided the armies. Between them lay no man's land, a stretch of barbed wire, cratered mud, and corpses. It could be 30 yards wide or 300, but it was always deadly. The trenches were meant to be temporary. Instead, they became homes, prisons, and graves. Soldiers lived in squalid conditions, knee-deep in water, surrounded by lice, rats, and the ever-present stench of death. Trench foot, a gangrenous condition caused by wet boots and cold, was rampant. Sleep was rare. Fear was constant. Commanders, trained in 19th century military doctrines, struggled to adapt. They ordered frontal assaults across open ground against machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery. The results were predictable and horrifying. Verdun, they shall not pass. In early 1916, the Germans launched a massive offensive at Verdun, a French fortress city symbolic of national pride. The goal, as stated by German General Erich von Falkenhayn, was not just to capture the city, but to bleed France white. Verdun was chosen not for its strategic value, but because the French would never allow it to fall, thus ensuring they would commit vast numbers of men to defend it. The Battle of Verdun, December 1916, became the longest single battle of the war. French General Philippe Pétain took command and made "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass, the rallying cry. Over 10 months, nearly 1 million soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Whole forests were obliterated. Villages vanished from the map. In the end, Verdun held, but at staggering cost. The ground had been won and lost dozens of times. Both armies were exhausted, and the war was far from over. The Somme, a river of blood. While Verdun raged in the east, the British prepared a massive offensive to relieve pressure on the French. The Battle of the Somme, November 1916. It would become one of the most infamous slaughters in military history. On July 1st, 1916, after a week-long artillery bombardment, British troops went over the top. They expected the German defenses to be destroyed. They weren't. German machine gunners, hunkered deep in bunkers, opened fire. That single day remains the bloodiest in British history. Nearly 60,000 casualties, over 19,000 dead. The battle dragged on for 5 months. New weapons appeared, most notably the tank, used for the first time in September. But the tanks were slow, unreliable, and bogged down in mud. By November, the Allies had advanced just 6 miles. Combined casualties on both sides exceeded 1.1 million. The Somme became a symbol of bravery, of waste, and of the futility of trench warfare. Passchendaele, drowning in the mud. A year later came Passchendaele, officially the Third Battle of Ypres, November 1917. A campaign remembered more for mud than maneuvers. Heavy rain turned Flanders into a swamp. Men and horses literally drowned in mud-filled shell holes. British commander Douglas Haig, undeterred by conditions, pressed on. After months of fighting, the British captured the ruined village of Passchendaele. They had gained a few miles of ground. The cost? 275,000 British casualties, and nearly as many German. One Canadian soldier wrote, "I died in hell. They called it Passchendaele. Life in the trenches." Between battles, the war didn't stop. It simply became a daily grind of survival. Soldiers rotated through the front lines, reserves, and rest camps. Days were filled with patrols, sniper fire, shelling, and the constant fear of gas attacks. At night, raiding parties slipped into no man's land under cover of darkness. Letters from home were lifelines. So were rituals. Tea, cigarettes, humor, and comradeship. Yet trauma ran deep. Shell shock, what we now know as PTSD, left many soldiers broken in mind as well as body. The Western Front became a crucible that forged a new kind of soldier, weary, skeptical, and bound forever to a lost generation. Innovation and industrial war. World War I was a proving ground for new technologies. Machine guns dominated the battlefield, making mass infantry charges suicidal. Artillery became the chief killer, with shells doing more damage than bullets. Poison gas, first chlorine, then phosgene and mustard gas, introduced a new horror as soldiers choked, burned, and went blind. Tanks, still crude, promised future mobility. Airplanes, once used for reconnaissance, began bombing and dogfighting. It was the first industrial war, where the scale of destruction outpaced any previous conflict. Mass production, mass death. The Christmas spirit dies. After the impromptu truce of 1914, generals on both sides ensured such fraternization would never happen again. Orders forbade it. Patrols increased. Anyone found mingling with the enemy faced punishment. The war's brutality deepened. There would be no more football games in no man's land. A front that didn't move. By 1917, the Western Front had hardly moved. The same towns and ridges were fought over again and again. Millions were dead. but no side had broken through. And still, the war dragged on. 5. The Eastern Front and other theaters. The lamps are going out all over Europe, but the fire will rage across the world. The Eastern Front, war on the move. While the Western Front sank into static trench warfare, the Eastern Front remained a war of sweeping movement, massive armies, and brutal reversals. The line was far longer, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and the terrain more open. Battles involved entire regions, not just villages or ridges. But the price in blood was just as steep. Early Russian offensives and German triumphs. In the opening weeks of the war, Russia mobilized faster than expected, invading East Prussia with 2 armies. But Germany responded with one of its most brilliant victories, the Battle of Tannenberg, August 1914, where Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff encircled and destroyed an entire Russian army. A second Russian army was mauled soon after. These twin defeats shattered Russian morale. But Russia's vast population allowed it to keep sending troops. The Central Powers had to divert resources east, easing pressure on France. Austria-Hungary's struggles. Austria-Hungary, by contrast, performed dismally. Their offensives into Serbia and Russian Galicia were disasters. They suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties and lost territory quickly. Germany increasingly took charge of the Eastern War effort, frustrated by its faltering ally. Still, the Russian war effort was hampered by poor logistics, internal dissent, and a lack of modern equipment. The Brusilov offensive and Russian collapse. In mid-1916, Russia mounted its most successful campaign, the Brusilov offensive, led by General Alexei Brusilov. It shattered Austro-Hungarian lines in Galicia, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Austria was saved only by German reinforcements. But this high point was followed by collapse. The Russian army, bleeding and undersupplied, began to break down. Discontent simmered back home. The Tsar's government was increasingly viewed as incompetent, corrupt, and out of touch. By 1917, the Russian Empire was teetering, and revolution was on the horizon. Serbia, Romania, and the Balkans. Tiny Serbia had shocked the world by repelling Austria-Hungary's first invasions in 1914. But by late 1915, after a renewed assault by German, Austrian, and Bulgarian forces, Serbia was overrun. Its army retreated across snow-covered mountains to the Albanian coast, suffering enormous losses. Romania, meanwhile, joined the Allies in 1916, hoping to claim Transylvania. It was quickly crushed by a joint German-Austrian offensive. By early 1917, most of Romania was occupied. The Balkans became a patchwork of shifting alliances, occupation zones, and proxy battles, a secondary front that drained men and morale from both sides. The Ottoman Empire, a new front opens. In late 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. This opened new theaters of war in the Middle East, the Caucasus, and North Africa. Gallipoli, the Allied disaster. One of the earliest and most dramatic campaigns was Gallipoli, 1915-16. The British, hoping to knock the Ottomans out of the war and open a supply route to Russia via the Dardanelles, launched a massive amphibious invasion. But the Ottomans, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, mounted a tenacious defense. The Anzac, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, troops, among others, landed on treacherous terrain and faced withering fire. The campaign descended into trench warfare. After months of stalemate and over 250,000 Allied casualties, the operation was abandoned. Gallipoli became a symbol of tragic futility, but also national identity, especially for Australians and New Zealanders. Armenian genocide. In the chaos of war, the Ottoman government turned against its own Armenian population, accusing them of colluding with Russia. What followed was the Armenian genocide, a systematic campaign of deportation, massacre, and starvation that killed an estimated 1.5 million Armenians. It remains one of history's darkest crimes. Arab revolt in the Middle East. In the deserts of Arabia, another drama unfolded. Sharif Hussein of Mecca, encouraged by the British, launched the Arab Revolt, 1916, against Ottoman rule. British officer T. Lawrence of Arabia, played a key role in uniting Arab tribes, sabotaging rail lines, and capturing key cities. This campaign, while romanticized, had real consequences. It stirred hopes of Arab independence, hopes that would later be betrayed in post-war colonial deals. The war in Africa and Asia. Though far from main theaters, the war touched Africa and Asia as well. Africa, in German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania. General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a guerrilla campaign against Allied forces, tying down tens of thousands of troops with a force of just a few thousand, including African soldiers known as Askaris. He remained undefeated until the war's end. Elsewhere, German colonies in Togoland, Southwest Africa, and Cameroon were quickly overrun by British, French, and South African forces. Asia and the Pacific. Japan, allied with Britain, seized German holdings in China and the Pacific. In 1914, they captured the German fortress of Qingdao. Australia and New Zealand occupied German Samoa and New Guinea. The war also deeply affected British India and French Indochina, which contributed over 1 million soldiers and laborers. These colonial troops served in Europe and the Middle East, often enduring racial discrimination, but proving vital to the war effort. A truly global conflict. By 1917, the war had reached every continent except Antarctica. The trenches of France, the deserts of Mesopotamia, the jungles of East Africa, and the icy fields of Galicia were all connected by a shared trauma. The world was bleeding, and still, the decisive blow had not yet come. 6. The war at sea and in the air. The old world was dying in mud and steel. The new was born in wings and iron beneath the waves. Naval warfare, command of the seas. In 1914, the British Royal Navy remained the most powerful maritime force on Earth, a crown jewel of the British Empire. Its primary objective was simple: maintain a blockade of Germany and secure global shipping lanes. Germany, though a rising naval power, could not match Britain ship for ship, but it would change the rules of the game with a deadly new weapon, the U-boat. The British blockade. From the war's outset, Britain used its navy to enforce a tight blockade of German ports. Though technically illegal under international law, the blockade was ruthlessly effective. It prevented vital imports, including food, oil, and chemicals, from reaching Germany. As the war dragged on, the blockade contributed to severe shortages and hunger across Germany. Civilian malnutrition became common. Some historians estimate 400,000 German civilians died from blockade-related causes. Germany's U-boat war. Germany countered with its own weapon, the Unterseeboot, or U-boat, a stealthy submarine capable of sinking ships without warning. Traditional naval warfare, with its chivalrous rules and declarations, was now obsolete. In 1915, a German U-boat sank the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania, killing 1,198 civilians, including 128 Americans. The attack caused international outrage and brought the U.S. closer to war, though Germany briefly curtailed its submarine campaign afterward to avoid further antagonizing the Americans. But by 1917, desperate to break the stalemate, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting all ships, including neutrals in Allied waters. It was a gamble, one that would ultimately draw the United States into the war. The Battle of Jutland. The largest naval clash of the war came in June 1916, off the coast of Denmark, in the Battle of Jutland. The British Grand Fleet under Admiral Jellicoe faced the German High Seas Fleet under Admiral Scheer. The battle was tactically indecisive. Both sides claimed victory, but strategically, Britain retained control of the seas. The German fleet remained bottled up for the rest of the war. It was the only major fleet engagement of World War I and the last great clash of battleships in naval history. Warfare in the skies. At the war's outbreak in 1914, aviation was barely a decade old. The Wright brothers had flown only 11 years earlier. Yet within months, fragile biplanes were soaring above battlefields, first as scouts, then as fighters and bombers. The birth of air combat. Pilots originally flew unarmed, waving at enemy aviators in passing. Soon, they began carrying pistols, then rifles. Eventually, engineers mounted machine guns, most famously with synchronization gears that allowed firing through the propeller. Air-to-air combat was born, and so was the myth of the flying ace. Pilots became celebrities. Manfred von Richthofen, the German Red Baron, scored 80 kills before being shot down in 1918. British aces like Albert Ball and Canadian pilot Billy Bishop also achieved fame. Dogfights became legendary, fast, deadly duels in the clouds. Yet the life expectancy of pilots remained short. Technology evolved so quickly that one could be obsolete in weeks. Bombing and Zeppelins. Airplanes also began bombing enemy positions and cities. Though early bombers could carry little payload, their psychological impact was real. Germany launched Zeppelin raids on London and other British cities. These massive airships, symbols of futuristic warfare, dropped bombs from high altitudes, terrifying civilians and forcing the creation of air defenses. By war's end, fixed-wing bombers had replaced Zeppelins, but the idea of total war, where the home front was a battlefield, had taken root. Aerial reconnaissance. Perhaps the most important use of aircraft during the war was reconnaissance. Observers in planes and kite balloons spotted enemy movements, directed artillery, and photographed trench systems. Air power became essential to the modern battlefield. Innovation in both realms. Both naval and aerial warfare inspired continuous innovation. Convoy systems were introduced in 1917 to protect merchant ships from U-boats, dramatically reducing shipping losses. Depth charges, hydrophones, and air patrols helped counter submarines. Airplanes evolved from flimsy canvas and wood to faster, more agile machines with metal frames. Carrier pigeons, wireless radios, and even carrier planes and late war prototypes hinted at future warfare. The war's legacy at sea and in the air. By 1918, the impact of naval and air warfare was clear. The British blockade had strangled Germany's economy. The U-boat campaign had failed to bring Britain to its knees and helped bring the U.S. into the war. Air power had changed not just tactics, but the very idea of war, introducing the concept of strategic bombing and civilian vulnerability. These new frontiers were just the beginning. The next Great War would push them even further, but their seeds were sown in World War I. 7. The home front, war beyond the trenches. This is not a war of armies, but of entire nations. Total war, a new kind of conflict. World War I was the first true total war in modern history. This meant that it wasn't just soldiers fighting. Entire societies were mobilized. Every citizen, factory, field, and coin was part of the war effort. Governments took control of economies, transportation, food supplies, and labor. Civilians were drafted into service, not with rifles, but with tools, typewriters, and nursing kits. The lines between front and home blurred. War was no longer confined to the battlefield. It was everywhere, mobilizing industry, the war economy. As millions of men went to the front, factories were retooled to produce bullets, boots, and battleships. Civilian industries were converted into arsenals of war. Governments introduced rationing. Meat, sugar, coal, and bread were strictly controlled. Price controls and wage caps to curb inflation. Vabunts. Citizens were urged or pressured to invest in their nation's war effort. Censorship and media control to maintain morale and suppress dissent. In Germany, the Hindenburg Program placed the entire economy under military control. In Britain, Lloyd George's Ministry of Munitions oversaw a vast increase in shell and arms production. Factories worked around the clock. Smokestacks and sirens became symbols of both patriotism and exhaustion. Women and the war effort. With millions of men at war, women stepped into roles they had long been denied. They worked in munition factories, known as munitionettes, where they handled TNT and other explosives. They became streetcar conductors, postal workers, farmers, and policewomen. Many served as nurses on the front, in units like the British Voluntary Aid Attachment, VAD, or the American Red Cross. Their contribution was vital and visible. For the first time, women's labor was considered essential to national survival. In many countries, this new visibility fed into the growing movement for women's suffrage. Britain, for example, granted limited voting rights to women in 1918, partly in recognition of their wartime service. Propaganda and public opinion. Governments didn't just control production, they controlled the narrative. Massive propaganda campaigns portrayed the war as noble, necessary, and just. Posters showed brave soldiers, villainous enemies, and patriotic women urging enlistment and sacrifice. In Britain, Lord Kitchener's stern finger became iconic. Your country needs you. In Germany, posters depicted the Allies as aggressors threatening the fatherland. In the US, Uncle Sam demanded loyalty and war bonds. But propaganda wasn't only external. It also sought to suppress dissent. Newspapers were censored. Letters from soldiers were redacted. In some countries, such as France, speaking against the war could lead to arrest. Civilians in the crossfire. For the first time in modern European warfare, civilians became deliberate targets. Zeppelin raids on London killed hundreds and injured thousands. German artillery shelled cities like Paris and Dunkirk. Naval blockades starved entire populations. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, food shortages grew acute. The turnip winter of 1916 to 17 saw families eating animal feed and forage plants. Disease spread rapidly, especially tuberculosis and influenza. The war's disruption of public health systems set the stage for the 1918 influenza pandemic, which would kill more people than the war itself. Labor, strikes, and unrest. The demands of war strained societies to the breaking point. Workers labored longer hours for fixed wages as inflation soared. In many countries, strikes and protests erupted. In Petrograd, Russia, food riots sparked revolution. In Berlin, strikes over food and working conditions signaled growing dissatisfaction with the Kaiser. In Italy, anti-war protests turned violent. The longer the war dragged on, the more it tested the cohesion of the home front. Victory required more than military success. It required keeping the public from collapse. The United States and the home front. When the U.S. entered the war in April 1917, it rapidly mobilized its home front with impressive efficiency. The Selective Service Act drafted millions. The War Industries Board coordinated production. The Committee on Public Information, led by George Creel, launched a massive propaganda effort. American industry quickly outproduced most of Europe. While the U.S. never faced the level of domestic hardship seen in Britain, France, or Germany, it still reshaped its society and emerged from the war as a new global power. The war's social impact. Across nations, the war left deep marks on social structures. Class barriers began to erode, as shared sacrifice fostered new solidarity. Women, though often forced back into traditional roles after 1918, had irrevocably altered their place in society. Ethnic minorities who served in colonial or segregated units returned home demanding recognition and rights. Pacifist movements gained traction, especially after 1916, as the scale of slaughter became undeniable. And perhaps most significantly, faith in institutions, leaders, and even in the idea of progress was deeply shaken. The belief that civilization was advancing, so strong in 1914, lay buried in the mud of Verdun. 8. The United States enters the war, the tipping point. The world must be made safe for democracy. President Woodrow Wilson, 1917. America's long neutrality. When war broke out in 1914, the United States remained firmly neutral. President Woodrow Wilson, elected in 1912, declared a policy of non-involvement, believing the conflict was a European affair. Public opinion was divided. Many Americans of British, French, and Belgian descent sympathized with the Allies. Large numbers of German and Irish Americans favored neutrality or even supported the Central Powers. Pacifists, socialists, and isolationists argued fiercely against intervention. But neutrality proved difficult. U.S. banks and industries traded heavily with the Allies. Over time, American economic interests became increasingly tied to an Allied victory. Unrestricted submarine warfare. The turning point came in the Atlantic. Germany, seeking to break the British naval blockade, launched a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boats began sinking all ships, including neutral and civilian vessels, entering Allied ports. The most infamous case was the sinking of the RMS Lusitania in May 1915. Among the 1,198 dead were 128 Americans. Though the U.S. didn't immediately declare war, the incident hardened public opinion and led Germany to temporarily curb its U-boat campaign. But by January 1917, desperate to choke Britain's supply lines, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, calculating that they could defeat the Allies before the U.S. could mobilize. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Zimmermann telegram. Then came the final spark. In February 1917, British intelligence intercepted and decrypted a message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico. The Zimmermann telegram proposed a secret alliance. If Mexico joined the war against the U.S., Germany would help it reclaim Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. When Wilson released the telegram to the public, it caused a national uproar. Americans, already outraged by sunken ships, now saw a direct threat to their homeland. The call to arms became irresistible. Declaration of war. On April 2, 1917, Wilson addressed Congress. The world must be made safe for democracy. We have no selfish ends to serve. We seek no conquest, no dominion. On April 6th, the United States formally declared war on Germany. Though it would take months before American troops saw combat, the psychological shift was immediate. The balance of the war had changed. Mobilizing the arsenal of democracy. America's entry brought immense resources to the Allied cause. Over 4 million Americans were mobilized. The Selective Service Act instituted a draft. Shipyards, munitions factories, and farms were ramped up at unprecedented speed. The Liberty Loan drives raised billions to fund the war. By late 1917, the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, under General John J. Pershing, began arriving in France. Pershing insisted U.S. troops fight as a distinct American force, not just reinforcements for British and French units. This decision would prove vital in the final battles of the war. Boosting Allied morale, crushing German hopes. For the Allies, America's entry was a godsend. Britain and France were exhausted, reeling from years of attrition and failed offensives. Russia was collapsing into revolution. German leaders knew their window to win the war was closing fast. The mere promise of American reinforcements changed strategy. The Allies prepared for a war of endurance, confident that U.S. manpower would eventually overwhelm the Central Powers. Germany doubled down on its plan for a decisive offensive before the Americans could arrive in force. The fuse was lit for the war's final and most decisive year. African American soldiers and segregation. The war also highlighted America's internal contradictions. Over 350,000 African Americans served in the U.S. military, many in segregated units. The most famous, the Harlem Hellfighters, 369th Infantry Regiment, fought with distinction under French command, earning praise and honors. Yet at home, they returned to a country still mired in racism, Jim Crow laws, and violence. The war's promise of equality remained, for many, tragically unfulfilled. Dissent and the home front. While many Americans supported the war, dissent remained. Socialist leader Eugene V. Debs was arrested under the Espionage Act for anti-war speeches. Thousands were jailed for resisting the draft. The U.S. government launched 100% Americanism campaigns, targeting German Americans, pacifists, and immigrants. The war made the U.S. a global actor, but at the cost of civil liberties, social tensions, and intense nationalism. 9. The Russian Revolution and its impact. Peace, land, and bread. Bolshevik slogan, 1917. The cracking of the Tsarist Empire. Russia entered World War I as one of the largest and oldest empires on Earth. Vast in territory, rich in resources, but riddled with inequality, inefficiency, and unrest. Tsar Nicholas II, an autocratic ruler by divine right, led a nation barely equipped for industrial war. By 1917, after 3 years of military disasters, food shortages, and corruption, the Russian people had had enough. Military collapse and civilian misery. On the battlefield, Russia suffered horrific casualties. By 1917, over 2 million soldiers had died, with millions more wounded or captured. Soldiers often lacked boots, rifles, or ammunition. Desertion became widespread. At home, the situation was worse. Grain requisitioning, a collapsing railway system, and mismanagement created massive food shortages. Bread lines stretched for miles. Prices soared. Strikes and protests grew, especially in the capital, Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg. The Tsar's decision to take personal command of the army in 1915 had left the government in the hands of his deeply unpopular wife, Empress Alexandra, and her advisor, the mystic Rasputin. Their influence was widely resented and mocked. The empire was disintegrating from within. The February Revolution, March 1917. On March 8, 1917, February 23rd in the old Julian calendar, protests erupted in Petrograd on International Women's Day over food and fuel shortages. What began as a demonstration swelled into a massive uprising. Soldiers were ordered to fire on protesters, but many refused, instead joining the crowds. Within days, the capital was in open revolt. The Duma, parliament, formed a provisional government, and on March 15th, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. A dual power emerged: the provisional government, liberal, pro-war, and the Petrograd Soviet, Workers' Council, socialist, anti-war. But this uneasy balance could not last. The Bolsheviks and the October Revolution. Into the chaos stepped the Bolsheviks, a radical socialist faction led by Vladimir Lenin, who had returned from exile in April 1917. With slogans like peace, land, and bread, and all power to the Soviets, they gained popular support by promising an immediate end to the war and redistribution of land. On November 7th, 1917, October 25th in the old calendar, the Bolsheviks staged a near-bloodless coup, seizing control of Petrograd. The October Revolution marked the birth of the world's first communist state. The provisional government collapsed. The Russian Civil War was beginning, but for now, Lenin turned to ending Russia's role in the World War. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, March 1918. Determined to make peace with Germany and focus on consolidating power, Lenin entered negotiations. The result was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on March 3, 1918. Its terms were brutal. Russia lost Ukraine, Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, and parts of the Caucasus. It ceded 1/3 of its population, half of its industry, and a huge share of farmland. Many Bolsheviks were horrified, but Lenin insisted, "We must close the door on this war." His priority was revolution, not territory. With the treaty, Russia exited the war, and the Eastern Front collapsed. Impact on the war. The consequences of Russia's withdrawal were enormous. 1. Germany could shift over 50 divisions westward, strengthening its western front for a final, all-out offensive in spring 1918. 2. The Allies lost a key partner and morale dipped. France and Britain now faced Germany alone, until U.S. forces could fully arrive. 3. A new ideological war had begun. The Bolsheviks called for global revolution, alarming Western governments. The seeds of the Cold War were sown here. But Germany's gains were short-lived. Though they controlled huge swaths of Eastern Europe on paper, they lacked the troops to govern it, and revolution now threatened to spread within their own borders. Civil War and the Red Terror. Back in Russia, civil war exploded between the Red, Bolshevik, and White anti-communist forces. Foreign powers, including Britain, France, Japan, and the U.S., intervened on the side of the Whites. But the Reds, ruthless and ideologically driven, ultimately prevailed. During the conflict, the Bolsheviks launched the Red Terror, mass arrests, executions, and suppression of opposition. The Tsar and his family were executed in July 1918 to prevent them from becoming rallying figures for monarchists. Russia had traded one form of autocracy for another, but its transformation into the Soviet Union was complete. The Eastern Front disappears. With Russia's exit, the Eastern Front vanished. Germany briefly controlled a massive empire stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, but it was a hollow victory. Occupation drained resources. The final German offensive in the West would have to succeed quickly, or Germany itself might collapse. 10. Final offensives and the end of the war, 1918. We are at the limit of our power. The war must end. German General Erich Ludendorff, October 1918. The Ludendorff Offensive, Germany's last gamble. With Russia out of the war and 50 divisions transferred west, Germany's high command, led by General Erich Ludendorff, prepared for a massive offensive on the Western Front. The goal: break through Allied lines before American troops could arrive in full force. The Kaiserschlacht, Kaiser's Battle, or Spring Offensive, began on March 21, 1918. Germany unleashed 3 million men in 5 coordinated assaults across the front. Stormtrooper tactics, small, fast-moving units that bypassed strong points and struck deep. Massive artillery barges, poison gas, and infiltration maneuvers. The initial results were shocking. Germany advanced up to 40 miles in some sectors, the deepest movement on the Western Front since 1914. British and French forces fell back in chaos. Paris came under artillery fire from more than 70 miles away. But Ludendorff made a critical mistake. There was no clear strategic goal. The offensives broke lines, but not morale. The German army outran its supply lines and lost cohesion. Crucially, Germany suffered over 800,000 casualties, losses it could not replace. And now, the Americans were arriving in force. The American Expeditionary Forces take the field. By mid-1918, over 1.2 million U.S. soldiers had landed in Europe. General John J. Pershing insisted they fight as an independent American force, not merely as reinforcements. American troops brought energy, morale, and fresh strength to the exhausted Allied lines. Key battles. Battle of Cantigny, May 1918. First major American victory, small but symbolic. Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood, June 1918. U.S. Marines fought fiercely, halting the German advance. Retreat? Hell, we just got here, one Marine famously said. Second Battle of the Marne, July 1918. A decisive turning point. The Allies counterattacked and halted the German offensive for good. American forces proved themselves under fire, and by summer, the initiative had shifted. The 100 Days Offensive. Beginning in August 1918, the Allies launched a series of coordinated attacks, known as the 100 Days Offensive. It was the final push that broke Germany's will to fight. Key moments. Battle of Amiens, August 8th, marked by surprise, tanks, aircraft, and a combined assault. German morale cracked. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army. Meuse-Argonne Offensive, September, November, the largest American operation of the war, involving over 1 million U.S. troops. They pushed through dense forest and stubborn resistance toward the German frontier. The Allies no longer relied on attrition alone. They used combined arms tactics, tanks, planes, infantry, and artillery working together, and learned from past mistakes. Germany, meanwhile, was breaking from within. Collapse on the home front. At home, Germany was unraveling. Food shortages had worsened. The British blockade continued to starve the civilian population. Strikes and mutinies erupted. In late October, sailors at the Kiel Naval Base refused orders to launch a final suicidal attack. This mutiny spread to workers and soldiers across the country. On November 7th, revolutionaries seized Munich, declaring a Bavarian Soviet Republic. Across Germany, workers' councils, Soviets, sprang up, inspired by the Russian model. The Kaiser's authority disintegrated. On November 9th, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. Germany was declared a republic. The Armistice. As German forces retreated and civil order collapsed, the new German government asked for peace. On November 11th, 1918, at 5 a.m., an armistice was signed in a railway carriage in Compiègne Forest, France. It took effect at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. That morning, the guns fell silent. Across Europe, soldiers emerged from trenches. Beds hung. Cheers erupted, but there was no clear sense of triumph. Only relief, mourning, and an overwhelming emptiness. Armistice or surrender? Though fighting had ended, Germany had not been invaded. This would later fuel the stab-in-the-back myth, the idea that Germany had been betrayed by internal enemies rather than defeated in battle. This false narrative would become a key pillar of Nazi propaganda in the 1930s. But in truth, Germany's defeat was total. It had gambled everything in 1918 and lost. 11. Aftermath and consequences redrawing the world. This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, 1919. The Paris Peace Conference, 1919. The war was over, but Europe was in ruins. Entire cities were flattened, fields churned into mud, and millions of people were dead, disabled, orphaned, or displaced. In January 1919, leaders from 32 nations gathered in Paris to shape the post-war world. The Paris Peace Conference was the largest diplomatic gathering in history up to that point. But power truly rested in the hands of the Big Four. 1. Georges Clemenceau, France, the Tiger, who wanted Germany punished. 2. David Lloyd George, Britain, seeking a balance between justice and pragmatism. 3. Woodrow Wilson, USA, idealistic architect of the New World Order. 4. Vittorio Orlando, Italy, demanding territory promised during the war. Russia, now under Bolshevik control, was excluded, so was defeated Germany at first. It would later be summoned to sign the peace, not negotiated. Wilson's 14 points. U.S. President Wilson arrived in Paris as a symbol of hope. In January 1918, he had outlined his 14 points, a visionary plan for peace based on self-determination for nations, open diplomacy, free trade and navigation, a League of Nations to prevent future wars. Wilson sought a peace without victory, avoiding humiliation or revenge. But his ideals clashed with the harsher realities of European politics. France and Britain, having suffered far more from the war, were less interested in idealism. Clemenceau famously quipped, "God gave us the 10 Commandments, and we broke them." Wilson gives us 14. The Treaty of Versailles, June 28, 1919. After months of tense negotiation, the most important result of the conference was the Treaty of Versailles, signed on the 5th anniversary of Franz Ferdinand's assassination. Key terms of the treaty. 1. Territorial losses for Germany. O lost Alsace-Lorraine to France. O Polish corridor created, cutting East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. O lost all overseas colonies, divided among allies as mandates. 2. Military restrictions. O army limited to 100,000 men. O no tanks, submarines, or aircraft allowed. O Rhineland demilitarized. 3. War Guilt Clause, Article 231. O Germany forced to accept sole responsibility for the war. 4. Reparations. O Germany required to pay 132 billion gold marks, about $33 billion, a crushing burden. Germany was not allowed to negotiate these terms. Its delegation was humiliated, and the treaty was signed under protest. The German people saw it not as peace, but as dictated punishment, a diktat. The League of Nations. One of Wilson's most cherished achievements was the creation of the League of Nations, a body intended to resolve disputes peacefully and prevent future wars. It included most major powers, except the United States. The U.S. Senate, suspicious of entangling alliances and determined to return to isolationism, rejected the treaty. The League, weakened from the start, lacked enforcement power. Its failure to prevent aggression in the 1930s would prove disastrous. Collapse of empires, rise of new nations. The end of World War I brought the death of 4 empires and the birth of many new nations. Austro-Hungarian Empire. Split into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Many ethnic groups found themselves minorities in new states, sowing future discord. Ottoman Empire. Dismantled in the Treaty of Sèvres, 1920. Turkey emerged under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk after a nationalist war. Arab lands were divided into British and French mandates, despite earlier promises to Arab leaders. Russian Empire. Now the Soviet Union under Bolshevik rule. Lost Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, briefly independent. German Empire. Became the Weimar Republic, burdened with reparations and internal turmoil. Lost prestige, land, and colonies. New nations formed, but many had unclear borders, conflicting claims, and diverse populations. The principle of self-determination was applied inconsistently, often favoring Western interests. Human and economic cost. The war left deep and lasting scars. Over 9 million soldiers dead and 7 million civilians. 21 million wounded, many disabled or disfigured. An entire lost generation of poets, artists, and thinkers. Economically, the war caused massive debt, especially for Britain and France. Hyperinflation in Germany disrupted global trade and production. The trauma of the war produced anxiety, disillusionment, and a crisis of faith in reason, progress, and civilization itself. Political consequences and extremism. The collapse of old orders gave way to radical ideologies. In Italy, economic turmoil and nationalist anger fueled the rise of fascism under Benito Mussolini. In Germany, resentment over Versailles and economic collapse set the stage for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. In Russia, the Bolsheviks consolidated their communist dictatorship and promoted world revolution. Instead of a war to end all wars, World War I had set the world on fire. The shadow of peace. Though the guns fell silent in 1918, the world remained deeply unstable. The peace settlements failed to address root causes and instead introduced new injustices. Colonial subjects were denied self-determination. Ethnic minorities in new countries faced discrimination. The global economy never fully recovered before the next crisis, the Great Depression. Many understood, even then, that the war's end was unfinished business. 12. Legacy of World War I, Memory and Meaning. The war to end all wars was only the beginning. The Lost Generation. World War I produced a generation that came of age amid unimaginable horror and never fully recovered. These young men and women, often referred to as the Lost Generation, emerged disillusioned with the values they had been raised to believe in: nationalism, honor, heroism, and the glory of war. In literature and poetry, their voices rang out. Wilfred Owen, who died a week before the armistice, wrote, "My friend, you would not tell with such high zest / to children ardent for some desperate glory / the old lie. Dulce et decorum est / pro patria mori." Erich Maria Remarque, a German veteran, captured the trauma in his novel All Quiet on the Western Front, portraying war as meaningless slaughter. American writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, though less directly affected, echoed this disillusionment in works like The Sun Also Rises. This was a crisis of faith in civilization, progress, and the promise of modernity. Memorialization and mourning. World War I introduced a new scale of mourning. Nearly every village in Europe had a war memorial. Millions of names were etched into stone, not by the hundreds, but by the thousands. In Britain, the concept of the unknown soldier was born. In Westminster Abbey, one anonymous soldier was buried to represent all those whose bodies were never identified. Similar tombs appeared in France, the US, and Italy. The red poppy, inspired by the poem In Flanders Fields, became a symbol of remembrance. It's still worn every November 11th, Armistice Day or Veterans Day, to honor those who served. Yet remembrance was never just peaceful. It was also political. In Germany, some war memorials emphasized betrayal, not loss. In France and Britain, monuments evoked both grief and pride. In Eastern Europe, where borders changed and empires collapsed, memory often fueled ethnic resentment. The war became part of national mythologies, some of which would be weaponized in the next global conflict. Technological and medical advancements. Though horrific, the war accelerated technological innovation. Military aviation, tanks, radio, sonar, and chemical warfare were rapidly developed. Mass production techniques pioneered in wartime would be used in peacetime industries. Plastic surgery and prosthetics advanced to treat wounded veterans, laying the groundwork for modern reconstructive medicine. Shell shock, initially misunderstood, pushed psychiatry to recognize combat trauma, leading to the modern concept of PTSD. These advances had dual legacies. They saved lives, but also made future wars even more deadly. Political and geopolitical shifts. World War I reshaped global power. The United States emerged as a financial and military power, though it retreated into isolationism. Britain and France, though victorious, were exhausted, politically, economically, and morally. Germany was humiliated and embittered. Russia, transformed into the Soviet Union, became an ideological challenge to the capitalist world. Japan, having gained German Pacific territories, began to assert itself regionally. The war also redrew the Middle East, with borders drawn by European powers that ignored ethnic and religious divisions, creating conflicts still ongoing today. Seeds of World War II. The most chilling legacy of World War I was that it did not end war. It set the stage for an even worse one. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to ensure peace, instead crippled the German economy and humiliated its people. excluded Germany and the Soviet Union from the international order, created a fragile Weimar Republic, vulnerable to extremism. In this environment, Adolf Hitler rose to power by promising revenge, revival, and rearmament. He exploited Germany's bitterness, using the memory of the war and the myth of the stab in the back to justify expansionism and genocide. By 1939, just 20 years after the Treaty of Versailles, the world was at war again. Cultural legacy. The war changed not only politics and borders, but art, music, and culture. The Dada movement and surrealism emerged from the absurdity and trauma of war. Jazz, brought to Europe by African-American soldiers, began to influence music worldwide. The war accelerated modernism, a rejection of old artistic forms and conventions. Social structures were shaken. Class hierarchies, imperial identities, and gender roles all began to shift. World War I wasn't just a military catastrophe. It was a cultural earthquake. 13. Conclusion. The war that changed everything. The lamps are going out all over Europe, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. Sir Edward Grey, British Foreign Secretary, 1914. A war like no other. World War I began with a gunshot in Sarajevo and ended with a redrawing of the global map. In just 4 years, it destroyed 4 empires, killed millions, and left an entire generation in mourning. It was a war of firsts. The first truly global war. The first to use tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons. The first where civilian populations became strategic targets. The first to be fought as a total war, mobilizing entire societies. And yet, despite its scale, it is often overshadowed by the conflict that followed. Unlike World War II, which has clear villains, cinematic battles, and a definitive sense of justice, World War I feels murkier, more pointless, more tragic. That is perhaps what makes it even more important to understand. The meaning of the Great War. World War I exposed the fragility of civilization. It showed how quickly rational industrial societies could descend into barbarism, how kings, ministers, and generals could send millions to their deaths in the name of pride, alliance, or empire. It was a war without clear moral lines. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides believed they were defending themselves, and both were destroyed by the very tools they had created. This moral ambiguity is part of why World War I still haunts us. It wasn't a war of good versus evil. It was a war of miscalculation, hubris, and mechanized death. Lessons still unlearned. Despite its horrors, the war's deeper lessons often went unheeded. The Treaty of Versailles, meant to bring peace, instead planted the seeds of World War II. The League of Nations, created to prevent war, failed due to lack of unity and power. The idea that war could be controlled, limited, or made noble was proven false, but that illusion would return again. Even today, the legacy of World War I echoes in borders drawn by colonial powers in the Middle East, nationalist grievances in Europe and the Balkans, debates over intervention, alliances, and the limits of military power. Why we must remember, to study World War I is not just to look backward, it is to hold a mirror up to ourselves. It reminds us that progress is fragile, peace is precious, war, once unleashed, is hard to contain. The soldiers who died at the Somme, Verdun, Gallipoli, and Passchendaele did not die for nothing, but they died because of something. A failure of diplomacy, imagination, and empathy. To honor them, we must remember their world, understand their time, and learn from their sacrifice. A final reflection. The Great War ended more than a century ago, but its legacy remains. It changed not just maps and governments, it changed us. It shattered old illusions and forced humanity to confront the terrifying potential of its own creations. It is said that history does not repeat, but it rhymes. To read the story of World War I is to listen to that rhyme and to ask, how do we make sure it never happens again?
Thanks for spending a little time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe for more gentle journeys into the past. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.